The Westfield Mall on a Thursday afternoon was exactly the kind of place where time moved differently. It was the dead zone between lunch and dinner, when the stores felt half awake, and the food court hummed with the background anxiety of people killing time. Corinne Mitchell sat at a corner table in the seating area outside the escalators, stirring her third coffee of the day while scrolling through her phone. She was waiting for her daughter Meredith to finish her appointment at the Sephora counter, something about correcting a spray tan disaster, and she'd positioned herself perfectly to be bored and irritated simultaneously. Corinne was 47 years old and had built her entire personality around the belief that she was always right. Her ex-husband had learned this the hard way during their divorce. Her daughter had learned it through a childhood of conditional approval. The waitstaff at her country club knew it intimately. And now, unfortunately for him, a 15-year-old boy named Marcus Webb was about to learn it too. Marcus had been sitting on the adjacent bench for about 15 minutes. He was lanky, dark-haired, with the kind of uncertain posture that teenagers develop when they're constantly questioning whether they belong anywhere. He wore a faded hoodie despite the warm October weather, and his backpack sat beside him, bulging with textbooks. He was waiting for his mom to pick him up from his summer volunteer position at the community center, except it was October, so it wasn't summer, and he was actually waiting for his older brother Deshaun to pick him up from his part-time job at the mall's food court. He was supposed to be here at 4:15. It was 4:12. Marcus didn't think he was doing anything wrong by existing on a bench. Corinne noticed him because Corinne noticed everything, particularly things that offended her sense of order. There was a boy, alone, in a public place, wearing a hoodie. His hand kept going to his backpack pocket. His eyes kept scanning the mall corridors. His leg bounced with nervous energy. To Corinne, this was a symphony of suspicious behavior. To Marcus, it was just Thursday. "Excuse me," Corinne called out, her voice cutting through the ambient mall noise like a knife. "Excuse me, you." Marcus looked up, confused. He had one of those faces that registered shock visibly. His eyebrows shot up, his eyes widened, and he pointed to himself uncertainly. "Me." "Yes, you. What are you doing here?" Corinne had already stood up, abandoning her coffee. She had that particular confidence of someone who had never once questioned her own judgment, which was simultaneously her greatest strength and her most dangerous liability. "I'm waiting for my brother," Marcus said. He sat up straighter, sensing that something was wrong. "He works at the food court. He's picking me up." "You're waiting," Corinne crossed her arms. "That's what you're calling it." This was the moment, the critical hinge point where the story could have gone a dozen different ways. Marcus could have been ruder. Corinne could have been slightly less aggressive. A mall employee could have walked past. But none of those things happened. Instead, Marcus made the mistake of being honest, and Corinne made the choice to weaponize her certainty. "I'm literally just waiting," Marcus said, more defensively now. "My mom drops me off here sometimes. I grab a smoothie, do homework in the bookstore. My brother comes and gets me." "You keep looking around," Corinne said, her voice dropping into that particular tone that mothers use when they're about to accuse someone of something terrible. "You keep touching your backpack. You're casing the place, aren't you?" "What?" Marcus actually laughed, a short, shocked bark. "No, I'm not, I'm just—" But Corinne had already made her decision. She could see it now. The narrative was clear in her mind, and once Corinne's mind settled on a narrative, facts became obstacles rather than information. "I'm calling security. We have a would-be shoplifter here, maybe worse." She was already pulling out her phone, already dialing the security line that she apparently knew by heart, already launching into a detailed description of a threat that existed only in her interpretation of a boy's fidgeting. Marcus felt his stomach drop. He felt his chest tighten. He felt, for the first time in a long time, completely unsafe in a place where he'd been safe 1,000 times before. "I'm not stealing anything," Marcus said, but his voice had gone thin and papery. He was standing now, too, because standing seemed safer than sitting while being accused of a crime. "Check my backpack if you want. I have textbooks, notebooks." "How convenient that you'd volunteer that," Corinne said, her phone pressed to her ear. "Yes, hello. I need security in the main seating area by the escalators. There's a young male, African-American, wearing a gray hoodie, early teens, possibly attempting to—" She didn't finish that sentence, and that was significant. She didn't finish it because she didn't actually have evidence of anything, but her tone conveyed something that made Marcus's blood run cold. She didn't finish it because the implication was more powerful than specificity. She didn't finish it because people would fill in the blanks themselves, and what they filled in would be worse than anything she could actually say. 3 minutes later, which felt like 30 years to Marcus, a security guard arrived. His name was Jerome Mitchell, and he was 34 years old, and he had decided 8 years ago, when he took this job, that he would never make an arrest based on someone's appearance alone. This decision had cost him a promotion and had been criticized by his supervisor. But Jerome had lived long enough to know how appearance became destiny for certain people, and he decided that his superpower wouldn't be enforcing the narrative. It would be breaking it. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of calm presence that made people want to tell him the truth. He was wearing the standard gray security uniform, and he had kind eyes, which meant that when Marcus saw him, some of the panic in his chest loosened just slightly. "What's the situation?" Jerome asked, directing his question to both of them but somehow looking only at Marcus. "This young man has been loitering," Corinne began, and Jerome noticed immediately that she didn't say allegedly. She didn't hedge. She didn't leave room for alternative interpretations. "He's been acting suspicious, touching his backpack repeatedly, scanning the mall, looking for vulnerabilities. I believe he's planning to steal from one of the stores or potentially engage in something worse." "Worse," Jerome repeated quietly. He wasn't asking her to clarify. He was nodding the word. He was aware of what that word meant and how it functioned in a sentence. He was aware of what it was designed to make him feel. "Yes, I have a responsibility to the safety of this mall," Corinne continued, gaining momentum. She was used to people accepting her narratives without question. "I saw something concerning and I reported it. Now it's your job to handle it." Jerome turned to Marcus, and he did something that Corinne found infuriating. He believed him, not because Marcus said anything particularly compelling, not because the evidence overwhelmingly pointed to innocence, but because Jerome had learned, through years of watching people and listening to their stories, that fear was generally an honest emotion, and Marcus was terrified. "What's your name?" Jerome asked gently. "Marcus Webb. I'm waiting for my brother Deshaun. He works at the food court. He's supposed to pick me up." Marcus's voice was steadier now. "I come here a lot. I'm in school. I volunteer at the community center. I'm not stealing anything." "I didn't ask if you were stealing," Jerome said. "I asked your name. Where do you go to school?" "Lincoln High, junior year." "Community center, what program?" "After-school mentorship. I'm working with elementary school kids, helping them with homework." Jerome nodded slowly, and Corinne watched this conversation with growing irritation. She could feel her narrative slipping away, like sand through her fingers, and she didn't like it. "He could be lying," Corinne interjected. "You can verify that later. Right now you should search his backpack. That's protocol, isn't it? Isn't it protocol to search suspicious backpacks?" Jerome turned to look at Corinne directly, and his expression was very patient and very sad, which was somehow worse than if he'd been angry. "Ma'am, I can ask him to open his backpack, but I need probable cause to search it. I can't search a citizen's belongings because they're sitting on a bench while black." Corinne flinched at the directness. "I didn't say anything about." "You said he was suspicious," Jerome continued, and his voice remained level and kind. "You said he was checking his backpack. You said he was looking for vulnerabilities. Those are all normal human behaviors. I see white teenagers do those same things about 50 times a day, and I don't call security on them. So I'm wondering, and I think everyone standing here is wondering, what specifically about this young man's behavior seemed suspicious." The silence that followed was the kind of silence that contained an answer. Corinne opened her mouth and closed it. She opened it again. "His body language, his demeanor, he looks like someone who—" "Like someone who what?" Jerome asked gently. "Like someone who doesn't belong here." And there it was, the truth, unfiltered and naked, hanging in the air between them like a confession. Jerome looked at Marcus, then back at Corinne. "Marcus, can I see what's in your backpack?" Marcus immediately unzipped it, spreading the contents on the bench: textbooks, a notebook filled with pencil sketches and chemistry notes, a plastic container with sandwich remains, a phone charger, the artifacts of a regular teenager's regular life. "And before you ask, no, I'm not going to let you search him further," Jerome said to Corinne, "because I have absolutely no reason to. This young man has committed no crime. He's waiting for his brother in a public mall. He's allowed to do that." "But what if—" Corinne started. "What if what?" Jerome turned to her, and his eyes were absolutely steady. What if the rules of probability and suspicious behavior apply differently to him than they do to everyone else? They don't. Not on my watch, not ever. Corinne's face went through a series of expressions: anger, embarrassment, indignation, and finally, a kind of cold fury. I was trying to help. No, Jerome said quietly. You were trying to enforce a story you'd already decided was true. That's different from helping. This was the moment when everything shifted. This was the moment when Corinne realized that her certainty, which had worked so effectively in so many other contexts, had failed her here. This was the moment when Marcus realized that at least one adult in the world was willing to see him clearly. This was the moment when Jerome did what he believed was right, knowing it would come with professional consequences. And somewhere in the building, completely unaware of what had just happened, Deshaun Webb walked out of the food court on his break, heading toward the escalators, about to change everything. Deshaun Webb was 19 years old and carried the specific weight that came from being the older sibling who'd learned too young that the world had different rules for different people. He'd been 18 when his father was pulled over by police during a routine traffic stop and came home with a black eye and a story about resisting that he'd never actually done. He'd been 17 when his best friend Joshua was questioned by police for matching a description of a robbery that had happened 3 miles away during the time Joshua was at school. Deshaun had developed, as a result, a very specific kind of alertness. Not paranoia exactly, but an awareness that survival sometimes meant knowing the difference between compliance and capitulation. He was working the register at the food court's Chinese place, had been for 6 months, and was saving money for community college. He had plans. They were modest plans: associate degree in business, maybe move into management. But they were his, and they motivated him to show up on time and do his work well. He was the kind of teenager that teachers wanted to hold up as an example, which meant he'd learned not to take compliments seriously, because he knew they often came with an asterisk for someone like him. When he saw the security guard talking to someone on the main seating area bench, someone wearing a gray hoodie that looked exactly like his brother's gray hoodie, his stomach did a specific drop that came from pattern recognition and fear. Deshaun took off his apron and moved quickly, not running because running would cause problems, but moving with the kind of urgency that came from knowing that his brother shouldn't be talking to security. His brother shouldn't be the focus of anyone's attention. His brother, at 15, was already learning the geometry of suspicion, and Deshaun couldn't protect him from that, but he could try. "Yo, Marcus," Deshaun called out as he approached, and his voice was carefully neutral, the voice of someone who'd learned to modulate his tone based on context. He was speaking to the security guard more than to his brother. "What's going on?" Jerome turned, and he recognized immediately what was happening. He'd seen this before: the older sibling arriving, the immediate shift in energy, the way young black men learn to make themselves smaller in the presence of authority. Jerome hated that he recognized this. He'd spent 8 years trying not to become the person who internalized these patterns, and yet here they were, etched into the behavior of 19-year-old strangers. "Your brother was just waiting for you," Jerome said before Corinne could speak. "Everything's fine." But Corinne could see the narrative shifting again, could see it moving into a different configuration, one that was somehow even more threatening in her mind. Now there were 2 of them. Now it looked like a situation. Now her fear ratcheted up. "Actually, I don't think everything is fine," Corinne said, stepping forward. "I think you should call the police and have them come talk to these 2. I'm not comfortable with this being handled internally." Marcus felt his stomach drop. Deshaun's jaw tightened. Jerome's expression hardened, not with anger, but with the specific kind of resignation that came from realizing that this conversation was going to escalate no matter what he said. "You can certainly call the police if you'd like," Jerome said to Corinne. "But I'm going to be very clear about what happened here because I suspect they'll ask. You saw a teenager sitting on a bench. You called security. I investigated. The teenager was waiting for his ride. No crime was committed. No suspicious activity was observed. Nothing illegal occurred." "He was scoping the place," Corinne insisted. "And now his accomplice is here." "Accomplice," Deshaun repeated quietly, and there was something in his voice that made Jerome look at him more closely. It was the voice of someone who'd heard this narrative before, who understood exactly what was being said beneath the words. "We're accomplices, for being brothers." "I didn't say that," Corinne said, but she had, absolutely and completely. I said that this situation warrants police involvement. Jerome's phone was already in his hand. I'll call them myself. I'll document what happened and officers can come and review the situation, but I want you to understand something. He looked directly at Karen. In about 10 minutes, 2 police officers are going to arrive and they're going to talk to these 2 teenagers. And those officers are either going to immediately recognize that nothing happened here, or they're going to find themselves under scrutiny for making an arrest or conducting a search based solely on appearance. Either way, you'll have made a report against 2 law-abiding young men. That will be on record. That will affect them. And I'll be testifying, if necessary, that I found no evidence of any wrongdoing. Karen's face went very still. Are you threatening me? I'm telling you consequences, Jerome said. I'm telling you what happens when you report people for crimes they didn't commit. They remember it. They get nervous around authority. They develop anxiety. Some of them start thinking they did something wrong even though they didn't. I've watched it happen. I'm telling you because I think maybe you didn't understand what you were doing. What I was doing was fulfilling my civic duty, Karen said coldly, and I stand by it completely. But Marcus was looking at his feet, and Deshawn was looking at the mall around them, and Jerome was looking at Karen with something that might have been pity, and that was when everything crystallized. Because Karen wasn't actually interested in truth. She was interested in justification. She was interested in a narrative where her fear was proportional to actual danger, where her judgment was vindicated, where her instincts were correct. The police actually arrived, not as a punishment, but as a consequence of Jerome's call about 12 minutes later. 2 officers, one in his 50s, one maybe early 30s. Jerome explained the situation to them with clear, direct language. No suspicious activity was observed. The young man was waiting for his brother. No crime was committed. A report was called in based on the individual's appearance and demeanor. The older officer looked at Marcus and then at Deshawn, and something flickered across his face. Not sympathy exactly, but recognition. Recognition of what was happening and why. Looks like a waste of everyone's time, he said to Jerome, and his tone was kind. But we've got to document the call. You 2 are fine to go. Be safe, okay? And that was it. The situation evaporated. The narrative that Karen had constructed with such certainty dissolved into nothing. She stood there, watching as Marcus and Deshawn left together, watching as they walked toward the parking garage, and she felt something she rarely experienced, the unsettling awareness that she might have been wrong. But Jerome was already filing his report, already documenting what he'd observed, already preparing for the fallout. Because there would be fallout. There always was when someone challenged a customer's narrative, especially a customer who looked like Karen looked and sounded like Karen sounded, and had the kind of confidence that came from a lifetime of being believed. Deshawn drove them to a parking lot near the river, away from the mall, away from people. He parked the car and they sat in silence for a long moment. That wasn't about you, Deshawn said finally. That's not about anything you did. I know, Marcus said, but he didn't feel like he knew anything. He felt like the ground had shifted beneath him, like the mall that had been a safe space 15 minutes ago was now hostile territory. He felt like he'd seen something fundamental about how the world worked, and he couldn't unsee it. Jerome was right, though, Deshawn continued. When he said it affects you, it does. That report exists now. Even though nothing happened, even though he said he was documenting the truth, it exists. What happens now? Marcus asked. Deshawn didn't answer immediately. He was thinking about their father, about Joshua, about all the moments he'd watched people get defined by someone else's fear. He was thinking about how Jerome had stood in the middle of that and refused to participate. I don't know, Deshawn said finally. But I know Jerome did something today that not a lot of people would do. He told the truth when the truth wasn't convenient. Neither of them knew yet what would come from that truth-telling. Neither of them knew that Jerome had friends in the police department, had been documenting patterns for years, had been building a case for departmental reform that he hadn't yet gone public with. Neither of them knew that Karen was about to become a very significant problem. But somewhere in that parking lot, watching the sun set over the river, they were beginning to understand that the story wasn't over. It had only just begun. Jerome filed his report at 5:47 p.m. on Thursday, October 15th. It was detailed, thorough, and damning. It documented Karen's accusations, his own observations, the lack of probable cause for any investigation, and his conclusion that the customer had reported suspicious activity based primarily on the individual's race and demeanor. It was the kind of report that could have ended up in a file somewhere, noted and forgotten. But Jerome didn't let it end there. He sent a copy to his supervisor, Derek Patterson, who was a man of a very different stripe from Jerome. Derek saw the report and saw trouble, not trouble with the investigation, but trouble with Jerome. Derek called him into his office on Friday morning. "Why are you making this a racial thing?" Derek asked, before Jerome had even fully closed the door. "The woman called security. I called you. You investigated. You found nothing. Why does your report read like an indictment of her character?" "Because her character is the issue," Jerome said, remaining standing. "She reported someone for existing while black. I documented that." "You don't know that's what she was doing," Derek said, and Jerome recognized this as the kind of argument that people made when they'd already decided the conclusion and were just now selecting the reasoning. She could have been genuinely concerned. She could have read his behavior as suspicious for legitimate reasons. "Did you read my report?" Jerome asked. "Yes." "Then you know I documented his behavior. Sitting, waiting, touching his backpack, looking around. Those are things every human being does approximately 15 times per day. She reported them as criminal premeditation." Derek sighed, the way people do when they're tired of a conversation they never should have had to have. "Jerome, I respect what you're trying to do. I do. But you can't go around making serious accusations about customers' racial bias. It's not professional. It exposes the mall to liability." "Liability for what?" "For investigating a false report." "For making our security team look like we're the ones with prejudice," Derek said. "You've just accused this customer of racism. She could sue us." And Jerome understood in that moment that the system was designed in a very specific way. It was designed so that documenting the truth could be framed as an accusation. It was designed so that the absence of racism was treated as optional, and the detection of racism was treated as a liability. It was designed so that Jerome's job wasn't to protect Marcus Webb from false accusation, but to protect the mall from the consequences of that false accusation. He was about to say something when Derek continued. "I'm putting a note in your file about this report. I'm also going to suggest that you attend some additional training on professional communication. This is a courtesy, Jerome. I'm giving you a chance to recalibrate." Jerome left that office, understanding that he was now a problem that would need to be managed. What Jerome didn't know was that Karen had also decided to escalate. She'd gone home that Thursday evening and written a detailed email to the mall's corporate office, copying the mall's general manager, the local police department, and, for some reason that suggested she'd been thinking about this for a while, the mayor's office. In the email, she described a security situation at the mall that had been handled inadequately. She wrote about her concerns regarding the profile of the individual and the insufficient response from the security team. She wrote about how she'd felt unsafe after the security guard had defended the suspect instead of conducting a proper investigation. She wrote, essentially, a formal complaint against Jerome that managed to suggest wrongdoing on his part while appearing to be a complaint about mall security in general. Corporate received the email at 9:13 a.m. on Friday morning. By Friday afternoon, the mall's general manager, Sandra Chen, was in Derek Patterson's office asking questions about this alleged incident. "Is this accurate?" Sandra asked, showing Derek Karen's email. "Partially," Derek said. "There was an incident. Jerome handled it. He's filed a report that I'm concerned about." "Concerned how?" "He's made serious accusations about a customer's motives," Derek said, and Jerome noticed later that Derek didn't mention the fact that Jerome had documented actual behavior and clear patterns. Derek just said accusations, which made Jerome's report sound like gossip instead of documentation. Sandra made a decision. She called Jerome into her office on Friday evening just before close. She was a professional woman in her late 50s, someone who'd worked her way up through retail management and understood the ecosystem of customer satisfaction and employee management. She was also, Jerome would learn, more concerned with the former than the latter. "I'm not going to ask you to change your report," Sandra said, which was an interesting way to begin a conversation that was absolutely going to be about changing his report. "But I am going to ask you to consider the broader implications of what you've written." "The implications are that someone made a false report based on bias," Jerome said quietly. "Or the implications are that a customer was concerned about suspicious activity and reported it," Sandra countered. And then when that report was investigated, nothing criminal was found. The system worked. Shouldn't we be able to just close this out? The system worked because I investigated properly, Jerome said. But if I'd been different, if I'd been someone who saw what she saw and interpreted it the same way, there might have been an arrest. There might have been charges. The system working is not the same as the system being just. Sandra was quiet for a moment. Are you planning to go public with this report? Should I be? I'm not suggesting anything, Sandra said. I'm asking if you have plans to share this with outside parties. Jerome realized in that moment what was happening. This was the moment where he was being offered a choice, silence or consequences. This was the moment where he was being given an exit strategy or an explanation of what would happen if he didn't take it. I don't know yet, Jerome said. Well, I'd encourage you to think carefully about what you're doing, Sandra said. We're already dealing with community complaints about mall security. The last thing we need is internal conflict that gets into the media. I'm sure you understand. Jerome understood perfectly. He understood that this was how systems protected themselves, not by being honest about what had happened, but by isolating the people who insisted on honesty. He understood that professional consequences would follow if he continued to tell the truth. He understood that he was being asked to choose between his career and his conscience. But what Sandra didn't understand was that Jerome had already made this choice when he became a security guard. He'd already decided that some things were worth the cost. On Saturday morning, Jerome called a lawyer. On Saturday evening, he called a journalist. On Sunday morning, the journalist called the mall's public relations office requesting comment on a story about racial profiling in mall security. By Monday, everything had changed. The local news ran the story on the evening broadcast. Mall security officer ALLEGES pattern of racial bias in customer reports. The story featured Jerome, looking tired but determined, explaining what had happened to Marcus Webb. The story featured an interview with Marcus himself, who talked about how terrifying it had been to be accused of something he wasn't doing. The story mentioned Karen by name and quoted her email. By Tuesday morning, Karen's identity was all over social media. By Wednesday, her employer had seen the story. By Thursday, she'd been placed on administrative leave pending an investigation into her conduct and whether her behavior aligned with company values. And by Friday, she was being investigated by police for filing a false report to law enforcement, which was, technically, a crime. Karen didn't leave her house for 3 days after the story broke. She sat in her pristine living room, surrounded by evidence of all her accumulated certainty. The tasteful paintings, the expensive furniture, the trophy collection of her life, and watched her world dissolve on the internet. The comments were vicious. Social media had decided that she was evil, that she was a racist, that she was representative of everything wrong with America. People dug into her past and found complaints she'd made at restaurants, comments she'd made on Nextdoor, a video of her yelling at a customer service representative. They assembled a narrative of a woman who'd spent her entire life treating people badly, and they were right mostly. But the internet's certainty was just as oversimplified as Karen's certainty had been. They didn't see a human being who'd inherited a particular worldview and had never been challenged on it. They saw a villain. Her daughter Meredith, who was 22 years old and had spent her entire life trying not to be her mother, had left her a voicemail. I can't be associated with this. I can't have this be who I'm connected to. I'm staying with friends for a while. Meredith's boyfriend had also seen the story and had quietly begun the process of ending their relationship. Her ex-husband had called to say, I told you so, in the way that people do when they've been vindicated by circumstance, though he hadn't actually predicted this specific outcome. He just predicted that someday her personality would catch up with her. Karen's employer, a mid-sized marketing firm where she worked as an account manager, had called her into a meeting and placed her on suspension pending their own investigation into whether she'd violated the company's diversity and inclusion policies. Karen's friends, or what she'd thought were friends, had largely ghosted her, which was interesting because it suggested that her relationships had been based more on proximity and social status than on actual connection. By Friday of the week following the story, Karen did something she rarely did. She visited the mall. Not during peak hours, not when there were crowds, but at 2:00 p.m. on a Friday afternoon when most people were at work and the mall was sparsely populated. She drove to the parking garage, parked, and made her way to the main seating area by the escalators. She didn't see Marcus, but she saw Jerome, who was on his break eating lunch at one of the mall benches while reading something on his phone. Jerome saw her at exactly the same moment and his body language shifted. He closed his phone. He set down his food. He waited. Corinne approached slowly, and Jerome noticed that she looked different. Not physically. She was wearing the same kind of designer clothes, the same expensive accessories. But she looked collapsed somehow, like the architecture of her certainty had come down, and she hadn't yet figured out what to rebuild. "I wanted to apologize," Corinne said, and her voice was very small. "I wanted you to know that I realized what I did was wrong." Jerome considered this. He'd thought about this moment many times in the past week. Whether Corinne would apologize, whether the apology would matter, whether anything could actually repair the damage she'd caused. "Does Marcus know you're apologizing?" Jerome asked. I didn't know how to find him." "He's easy to find," Jerome said. "He comes here 3 times a week, works at the community center, comes to the mall afterward." Corinne looked like she was assembling the words to a question or an explanation, and Jerome waited to see which one it would be. What came out was worse than either. "I didn't mean it the way everyone is saying I meant it." "How did you mean it?" Jerome asked. "When you told me he was casing the place for things to steal, when you implied he might be planning something worse, how did you mean that without it being about the fact that he's black?" "I was concerned," Corinne said, and her voice was taking on that defensive tone again, the one that suggested she was moving from apology to justification. "I was trying to be safe." "Safe from what?" Jerome asked. "Safe from a 15-year-old boy sitting on a bench. What exactly was the threat you were protecting yourself from?" Corinne didn't answer, because the answer was obvious. The threat she was protecting herself from was the one that existed only in her mind, the one that was built from patterns and media narratives, and a lifetime of learning that certain people were dangerous just by existing. "I've lost my job," Corinne said instead. "My daughter won't talk to me. My friends have abandoned me. I'm being investigated by police. Isn't that enough?" Jerome looked at this woman who'd had every advantage, every opportunity to learn and grow and become better, and he felt very tired. "No," he said finally, "it's not enough, because none of that changes the fact that you did it. None of that makes Marcus less scared. None of that gives him back the afternoon he spent in terror because you decided that looking while black was a crime." "What do you want from me?" Corinne asked, and she was actually crying now, tears sliding down her face. "What will make this right?" Jerome considered this question very carefully. "I want you to understand what you did, not the consequences. The consequences are just noise. I want you to actually understand that you targeted a child because of fear, and I want you to spend enough time with that understanding that you never do it again. I want you to see a young black man from now on and have to work to override the instinct to be afraid. And I want you to do that work every single time for the rest of your life." "I can't promise that," Corinne said quietly. "I know," Jerome said. "That's why you won't do it." Corinne left the mall. She drove home. She sat in her house and did what she should have done on the night this happened. She cried, not from the consequences, but from the clear, overwhelming realization that she'd been wrong. Not just about Marcus, about a lot of things, about a lot of people. She'd spent her entire life being certain, and it turned out that her certainty was built on a foundation of fear that didn't actually correspond to reality. She wouldn't go back to her job. The marketing firm had decided that the reputational damage was too much, and they let her go. She would attend a restorative justice program for people who'd perpetuated bias, which was deeply uncomfortable and necessary. She would spend years trying to understand how she'd become someone who would accuse a child of crimes he hadn't committed. She would eventually apologize to Marcus directly, though it would take her years to find the courage. But the thing about consequences is that they don't happen in a neat order. While Corinne was beginning her slow work of understanding, other things were unfolding that nobody had predicted. Not for standing up to Corinne, not officially. The termination letter cited insubordination, failure to follow corporate protocol, and unauthorized contact with media. What it actually meant was that Jerome had made the wrong people uncomfortable, and the wrong people had the power to fire him. He met with Sandra Chen for the final time in the security office, a small room filled with monitors and filing cabinets. She was professional and distant, the way people are when they're delivering decisions that have already been made. "We've decided that you're not a good fit for this position," Sandra said. Your values don't align with the mall's values. The mall's values include protecting people from false accusations, Jerome asked. The mall's values include maintaining professional relationships with our customers while ensuring a safe environment, Sandra said. You've done neither, in my assessment. I've protected someone from a crime that didn't happen, Jerome said. That's exactly what I was hired to do. You've made this into something larger than a simple security matter, Sandra said, and Jerome noticed that she didn't actually deny what he'd done. You've created a media situation that's affected our business. Customers don't feel comfortable here anymore. They're worried about being recorded and put on the news. You've created that. Jerome understood, in that moment, a fundamental truth about institutions. They protect themselves, not their members. The mall would rather lose Jerome than risk future Karens losing confidence in their security team. The mall would rather sacrifice one honest guard than confront the patterns that one honest guard had exposed. I want you to know, Jerome said, that I documented everything. Every interaction I've had with suspicious reporting, every customer complaint that had nothing to do with actual crime. I have files. And if this is how you're going to treat someone for doing their job correctly, I'll be sharing those files with organizations that care about this kind of pattern. Sandra's face remained professional. You can do whatever you feel is necessary, but understand that you'll be going against a corporation with legal resources to match. My advice, as one human being to another, is to take the severance package and move on. Jerome didn't take the severance package. Instead, he took his files to a civil rights organization. He took them to journalists. He took them to local activist groups that had been fighting for police reform and security accountability for years. He became the kind of person that corporations fear, the whistleblower, the one who decided that his career wasn't worth his integrity. What happened next was not something that Jerome had predicted, and it unfolded in ways that nobody could have anticipated. A local activist organization called Community Over Profit had been building a case against the mall for years. They documented instances of aggressive security tactics against young people of color. They'd interviewed former customers who'd been followed in stores or stopped for no reason. They'd built a pattern, but they'd never had an insider before. They'd never had someone from security willing to put their name to the evidence. Jerome's files were comprehensive. They included every instance, going back 5 years, where Jerome had concluded that a call-in complaint was based on bias rather than actual suspicious activity. They included demographic data that showed a clear pattern. Customers of color were reported far more frequently than white customers for identical behaviors. They included Jerome's own detailed notes about calls like Karen's, where the suspicious activity was literally just existing while not white. The organization began planning their response. They met with journalists. They prepared to go public with the files. They contacted Marcus and Deshawn to ask if they'd be willing to participate in a broader campaign about racial profiling in retail spaces. Both of them said yes. Within 2 weeks, a major news outlet was preparing to run a 6-part investigative series about racial bias in mall security. The series would be titled Shopping While Black and would feature case studies from multiple malls, interviews with victims of racial profiling, and an analysis of how security corporations were failing to adequately train their staff on unconscious bias. Jerome would be featured prominently, so would Marcus, so would the data that Jerome had been collecting. The story broke on a Sunday evening, exactly 3 weeks and 2 days after the incident at the mall. Shopping WHILE Black, Investigation REVEALS Systematic Racial Profiling AT Major Retail Locations, read the headline. The article was accompanied by photographs of Jerome, looking dignified and serious. It featured an interview with Marcus, now 16, talking about how the experience had affected him. It included quotes from the civil rights organization explaining what the data showed. Within hours, it was trending on social media. Within a day, other media outlets were picking it up. Within a week, it had become a national story about a systemic problem that had been hiding in plain sight. The casual way that security guards and store employees used racial profiling as their primary method of threat assessment. The mall's corporate office went into crisis management mode. They hired an external consulting firm to audit their security protocols. They announced a comprehensive training program on unconscious bias. They released statements about their commitment to creating a welcoming environment for all customers. None of it felt genuine because none of it was damage control, nothing more. Derek Patterson, the mall's security supervisor, discovered that his emails had become exhibits in the investigation. Emails where he discussed handling Jerome had been subpoenaed and made public. Emails where he downplayed concerns about racial bias had been published in the second article of the series. By the end of the week, Derek was no longer the mall's security supervisor. Sandra Chen, the general manager, was also swept up in the fallout. She'd made decisions that, in retrospect, looked like she was prioritizing profit over ethics. She'd chosen customer satisfaction over employee protection. She'd chosen the path of least resistance. By the end of the month, she'd been terminated. The mall itself was sued by a civil rights organization. The suit alleged systematic discrimination in security practices and demanded a comprehensive overhaul of hearing, training, and protocols. The mall eventually settled for a substantial amount of money, agreed to all the demanded changes, and began a long process of institutional reform. But the most interesting thing that happened was this: people started to care. People who worked in retail started to think about their own biases. Store owners started to examine their security practices. Customers started to notice when they were being profiled and started to call it out. Jerome was offered a position as a security consultant for a major civil rights organization. He would travel to different retail locations, audit their practices, and help them build systems that reduced bias. It wasn't the job he'd trained for, but it was the job he was meant to have. Marcus, in the aftermath of all this attention, was invited to speak at his high school assembly about his experience. He talked about fear, about seeing someone stand up for him, about the importance of people who were willing to challenge the narratives that society had constructed. He was invited to join a youth council that advocated for police and security reform. He discovered that he had a gift for public speaking and for helping other young people process trauma. Deshawn continued working at the food court while taking classes at the community college that Jerome had recommended. He'd saved enough money to move his family into a better apartment. His parents had watched the story and had finally understood why Deshawn had always been so careful around authority. They'd understood for the first time that his caution wasn't paranoia, it was pattern recognition. It was survival. And then, almost 2 months after the initial incident, something unexpected happened. Meredith called her mother, not to forgive her. Forgiveness wasn't really Meredith's to give, but to talk. For the first time in years, they actually talked. Corinne told her daughter that she'd been in therapy, that she'd been doing the work to understand her biases, that she'd realized how she'd raised Meredith to be like her and how she regretted that. "I hurt a lot of people," Corinne told her daughter, "and I'm sorry, I'm genuinely sorry." "I believe you," Meredith said, which was interesting because she meant it. She could hear something in her mother's voice that had never been there before, actual humility, not just defeat. Corinne arranged a meeting with Marcus. It took months for Marcus to say yes and even longer for him to actually show up. They met at a coffee shop, neutral ground, and Corinne said everything she needed to say. She explained that she understood what she'd done. She explained that she was working to change. She asked if there was anything she could do to repair the harm. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "You could volunteer," he said finally. "At the community center where I volunteer, you could help with the elementary school kids. You could show them that adults can change their minds." So Corinne started volunteering. She showed up every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon at the community center, helping with homework, and slowly, over the course of months, she became someone different from who she'd been. Not perfect, not absolved, but genuinely changed. Jerome ran into her one afternoon while he was visiting Marcus at the center, and they had a conversation that was oddly gentle. "I heard you were volunteering here," Jerome said. "I am," Corinne said. It's harder than I thought it would be. The kids don't trust adults, and that's because adults have given them reasons not to trust us. I'm trying to be a different kind of adult." "That's good," Jerome said, and he meant it. He'd learned over the course of the investigation and the aftermath that change was possible. It was rare and it was difficult, but it was possible. The security guard who'd called Marcus into the mall that day, Jerome, became, through a series of decisions that seemed small at the time but were actually monumental, the person who changed how an entire industry thought about racial bias. He became a voice for reform, a consultant to major retail corporations, a speaker at security conferences about the importance of challenging your own assumptions. And the story of what happened on that October Thursday afternoon became more than just the story of one incident. It became a story about how speaking truth could matter, how standing up for someone could create ripples that reached far beyond the immediate situation, how institutions could be forced to change when enough people demanded it. Jerome was awarded a civil rights prize by a national organization. In his acceptance speech, he talked about Marcus, about the moment he'd chosen to believe a teenager over a customer, about how that choice had seemed small at the time but had turned out to be everything. "I was just doing my job," Jerome said during the speech. "I was just making sure that someone wasn't punished for existing, but that apparently was revolutionary. That apparently was worth losing my job for. And if that's true, if refusing to participate in racial profiling is revolutionary, then we have a lot of work to do." The speech went viral. It was shared millions of times. It was used in training programs for security guards across the country. It was included in college curricula about ethics and institutional responsibility. It became, in many ways, the thing that Jerome would be remembered for. But the thing that mattered most to Jerome wasn't the prize or the recognition or the impact he'd had on the industry. It was something that happened 8 months after the original incident, when Marcus came to him and said, "I want to be like you. I want to be someone who stands up for people when it costs something to do it." Marcus decided that day that he would study criminal justice with a focus on reform and accountability. He would become an advocate for people who were targeted by institutional bias. He would carry forward the work that Jerome had started, the work of building institutions that looked for truth instead of seeking to confirm pre-existing narratives. And that, Jerome realized, was what real change looked like. It wasn't just about changing policies or winning cases. It was about creating other people who would stand up and speak truth when it mattered. It was about the ripples spreading outward, touching lives that the original incident had never directly impacted. 3 years after the incident, on a rainy November afternoon, Marcus, Deshawn, Jerome, and Corinne all found themselves at the mall at the same time. It was an accident, just coincidence and the geometry of their lives overlapping. They ended up sitting in the seating area by the escalators, the exact place where everything had started. "I still remember being terrified," Marcus said, looking at the bench where he'd been sitting when Corinne accused him. "I remember being angry," Deshawn said. "I remember being certain," Corinne said quietly. "I remember realizing we had to change," Jerome said. "All of us, the whole system." They sat together in that space, 3 years and a lifetime later, and understood that the story wasn't about one security guard or one accusation or one mall. It was about what happens when someone decides that their integrity is worth more than their comfort. It was about the collision between systems built on fear and a person brave enough to ask, "What if we built systems on truth instead?" The story ends where it began, in that seating area with people sitting on benches, waiting for their lives to resume. But everyone sitting there was different now. They carried with them the weight of what had happened, the understanding of what was possible, the knowledge that one moment of choosing truth could change everything. And somewhere in the mall, other security guards were making their own choices. Other people were watching their assumptions. Other systems were beginning slowly to change. Because that's what happens when someone stands up. That's what happens when someone refuses to participate in the narrative of fear. That's what happens when one person decides that doing the right thing is worth more than keeping their job.